You're listening to The Interactome, a podcast by a group of young researchers who want to connect you to the world of science by sharing their stories and perspectives. Just in case their bosses are listening, they want to remind you that the opinions expressed here are their own. They also want to remind you not to take anything they say as medical or professional advice, as they are not doctors. Not yet, anyway. Stay tuned about that. And, without further ado, welcome to the Interactome.
Hello, Interactome viewers. Welcome back to our podcast. We're so excited to have you here to discuss perhaps a spicy topic today.
Spicy.
Well, let's see. I'm quite excited to discuss this. So for this episode, we are going to be talking about stem cell biology and the ethics that are related to using stem cells in medicine. So to start off, I'll just quickly introduce myself. So hello or welcome back to any viewers that are listening to this again. But my name is Maia. I am a PhD student in molecular and cell biology, and I'll be hosting today's episode. So for a little background, this semester at my university, I'm teaching a stem cell course. So as a result, I've been constantly thinking about stem cells 24/7 and how interesting they are all semester long. And I just really wanted to share everything that I've learned and the really interesting ethical issues with my lovely podcast co-hosts today. So I'll pass it on to Lauren. If you could quickly introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren, and I am a research associate, so research technician, and I work in a cancer biology lab.
Hi everyone, I am Sarah. I am 1/5, but I think now 1/6 of the Interactome. And I was going to say I have a limited knowledge of stem cells. I've learned about them in a few classes, but haven't focused heavily on them, so I'm excited to learn more about them. And yeah, talk about the real life applications of them too.
Yeah, we are so excited to have you guys here. And I also wanted to pop that question to you too, Lauren. So how have you heard about stem cells and kind of like what's your current knowledge about them right now?
Yeah, so I was just talking to Maia and Sarah before we hopped on this podcast recording. And I was telling them that, I have a limited background in stem cell biology, so I was listening to some podcasts, and I actually was listening to an interview with the SERM CEO, and so that's the stem cell agency in California, and she had a lot of really interesting kind of things that she was talking about like the future of stem cell application in medicine and biotechnology. And I also am a little bit familiar about on stem cells in cancer. There has been like some work done on using stem cell transplants for mainly leukemia and lymphoma patients. And so, yeah, my background is limited, so I am so excited to kind of mine Maia's knowledge base in this area.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn quite a bit today. And I am also really excited to talk about that leukemia stem cell transplant that you mentioned. It's a really, really cool development in medicine. But I guess it makes the most sense to start off to talk about what exactly is a stem cell. So you guys might have heard about stem cells in your classes or in the news. There's all sorts of like interesting research and applications happening, like we've mentioned, where stem cells are kind of like the focus of that. So what exactly is a stem cell? Well, a stem cell is special because it has these two properties that make it a stem cell. So the first property that they have is called self-renewal, which means that they can grow and make more of themselves. And the second property, which I think is probably the most interesting one, is called potency. So what potency means is that the stem cell has the ability to become a different type of cell. Or to say it like more clearly, it has the potential to become a specialized cell. So we all have specialized cells in our body. So we got skin cells, we got liver cells, we got neurons in our brain. Those are cells that are found there, and those are all specialized, differentiated cells. And all of those differentiated cells had to have come from somewhere, and their origin is basically the stem cells. And what's pretty cool about stem cells is that there are all sorts of like different kinds of stem cells that you have at one point in your life or the other. So this is where the potency properties, the potency property of stem cells comes in. So there's kind of like a scale of how potent a stem cell can be, or how many things it can turn into. So if you imagine like on one side of the scale, you have stem cells that are unipotent. So this means that they can have the ability to turn into one type of specialized cell.
So
and then
I have a question.
Oh yeah,
so
of course.
The unipotent stem cells, you say that they can only turn into one type of specialized cell. Are all unipotent stem cells going to turn into the same specialized type of cell, or do they kind of turn into different cells?
That's a good question.
Oh, sorry. What was the second part of your question? Do they all turn into
the same type of cell, or a different, like different unipotent stem cells will specialize into different type of cells?
Oh, yeah. That is a great question. So to explain it, so it's kind of like the first option that you mentioned. So there are different kinds of unipotent stem cells. So for example, an example of a unipotent stem cell is a muscle stem cell, because those stem cells can only turn into muscle cells, and they can't turn into skin cells, and they can't turn into liver cells, and so on and so forth. So there are a few examples of that around your body of the unipotent guys. So that's kind of like one end of the potency spectrum, which is interesting. But I think probably what captures a lot of people's attention is the other side of the spectrum, where cells can be pluripotent or totipotent. And those terms just refer to stem cells having a lot of potential to turn into different cell types. So, for example, if a stem cell is pluripotent, that means that it has the ability to turn into every kind of cell in your body. So if we have a pluripotent stem cell, it can turn into your skin cell, a neural cell, intestinal cell, etc., etc. And it's pretty cool to think that just this one kind of simple original cell has the potential, do you see what I did there? Has the potential to turn into so many different kinds of cells in our body.
Yeah. Sorry, that's just crazy to think that our body's biology is so sophisticated that I almost think of it as like a basic cell, like kind of like a skeleton, and like depending on the environment or the signals it's sent, it can like morph into like a neural cell versus a like muscle cell. Like that's crazy to me.
To quickly add on to what you're saying, Lauren, I think this kind of phenomenon of stem cells becoming other types of cells is like this very beautiful mystery that has like captivated biologists and maybe people that weren't biologists, and when science like hadn't really taken off yet. But even like in the really olden days, people were always curious about, how do organisms come about? Like, how are we growing from like babies? Like, how does development happen? And stem cells play a lot of role in that. And it's like what you're saying, it all has to do with the environment around the stem cells, all the signals that the other cells are sending, all the proper conditions. It's like there's like recipes for all the different kinds of cells that the stem cell can become. And it just tells the cell what to do and what path to take.
It's really cool because going off of, I guess, both your points, it's almost like a reverse way of thinking about your cells. I feel like a lot of times, at least throughout the years when I was growing up, I would think, oh yeah, like my skin cell is my skin cell. And that's true. but that was its end destination. It wasn't always that skin cell. And kind of like how Lauren said, your ground zero of cells are your stem cells. But I did have a question, kind of backtracking a little bit. So I know unipotent stem cells will differentiate into one type, but does that mean a pluripotent stem cell can also become like a muscle cell, like you said? Or are muscle cells always going to come from a unipotent stem cell?
Yeah, that's a great point. So it's a little tricky, I think, to explain, because I think with a lot of the terms for potency that come around, it's a lot of nuance, I think. So you're definitely correct in that, let's say we're talking about our good friend, like the muscle stem cell, that's unipotent. So that definitely gives rise to muscle cells down the line. But when we're thinking about pluripotent stem cells, those are the kinds that can differentiate into any cell in your body. Those are only around in your body at the time of fertilization. So when you were a zygote, after sperm met egg, and after a few developmental steps, that's where your pluripotent stem cells are. And as you progress through embryonic development, and you're beginning to develop organs and everything that makes you, all of that, so the potency of those cells that were there decreases. So you're no longer going to have pluripotent stem cells, basically after a certain stage in development, before you're even born. So to answer your question, it's the pluripotent stem cells give rise to these kind of intermediates that are that can give rise to other things in your body, which can include the stem cells. But this is actually something that's kind of hotly debated in the stem cell field, because we don't know exactly what's responsible for what's responsible for maintaining adult stem cells. So those are the unipotent guys. Sorry, let me backtrack a little bit. So we don't really know what's responsible for maintaining those later stage stem cells. Are they just coming right off of embryonic development, or are they popping up somewhere else? So it's still kind of a mystery where those are kind of becoming or coming into their role, I should say.
Interesting.
So it's a good question, and people don't really quite know yet.
Okay. And so I know also one last thing, and then we can move on from potency. But I remember learning, and correct me if this is not right, but totipotent? I've heard it pronounced so many different ways.
Oh, yeah. Any way is fine.
Those kind of stem cells can differentiate into absolutely anything. But pluripotent is missing one thing, right? They're not allowed to... Yep. I forget what it is, though.
Yeah, so the totipotent guys, so those guys are the ultimate stem cell. So they can differentiate into everything. And the main difference between totipotent and pluripotent stem cells is that totipotent stem cells can differentiate into the cells that are found in the placenta. So pluripotent stem cells can do everything that ends up in your body, but they can't turn into the cells that are in the placental area. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
But yeah, great questions, everyone. So with that, I guess this is a good segue to talk about where stem cells come from. So we kind of mentioned earlier in the question that Sarah asked that we kind of have these two broad categories of stem cells. So we have embryonic stem cells, and those are the ones that are known to be very potent. So either pluripotent or totipotent. It doesn't kind of really matter which is which, but just know that they're very potent and can turn into anything that your body has. And we also have adult stem cells, which is a little misleading. You don't have them, you don't have as many when you're adults, but they're basically just referring to the stem cells in your body that are there after you're born. So it's kind of mysterious how these adult stem cells are maintained after birth and how they can differentiate them between the embryonic ones and the adult ones. It's not super clear, but I think the coolest thing about stem cells, and probably the things that have the most potential, are the human embryonic stem cells. So the ones that are really early stage in development and have the potential to turn into several things. So this begs the question, where do human embryonic stem cells come from? And this is actually the source of a pretty big ethical controversy in the scientific community. So we know that it's kind of a little, you can infer a little bit from the name, right? So human embryonic stem cells come from embryos. And the reason why this is a big controversy is because in order to get those human embryonic stem cells, this results in the destruction of the embryo. So there's no way to kind of isolate the embryonic stem cells from the whole embryo itself without resulting in its destruction. And this is, again, like a hotly contested topic, but a lot of advances in science have relied on human embryonic stem cell culture lines since there's so much potential research and therapeutic applications you can do with them. Since we mentioned earlier that we have a lot of recipes and signals and different environments we can put the stem cells in, and they can turn into whatever we want. So this is a really valuable tool in studying all sorts of things in biology, but it does bring forth an ethical issue. So one thing that I want to point out is that there is a common misconception that embryonic stem cells come from aborted fetuses. And just want to make the announcement that this is not true. It's never true. Humic embryonic stem cells that are used in science and research labs, they're always coming from donated embryos that are formed by in vitro fertilization. So these embryos have never seen a womb. They're made in a lab, and they're donated with consent by the parents that no longer have a need for them.
Yeah, that's a really good clarification. Thank you. Because I think it can be really challenging when you are seeing kind of like stories in the news or just like social media, kind of just generally in your intake of information about stem cell therapies or stem cell biology. And they can be like really emotional arguments founded upon like falsehoods, essentially. So I'm really glad that you brought that up and clarified that, because it's not really honestly, it's not that easy to find out that information unless you know where to look, right?
Yeah, I 100% agree, because this is actually something that I learned when taking this class. I didn't know that the embryos that they were taking the embryonic stem cells from, I didn't know that they came from in vitro fertilization.
Yeah.
But that in itself can raise a lot of ethical issues as well, because depending on your definition of where life begins, some believe that life begins at conception, so when sperm meets egg, and so they kind of value an embryo as like a potential human being. And thus, if you generate human embryonic stem cell lines from an embryo, this, in some people's minds, is equivalent to like murder or taking someone's life. But others will think that, oh, you know, like this is really early in the developmental stage. Perhaps it's not really considered a human being since it hasn't attained consciousness or like experienced life outside the womb, or hasn't developed
or even
further.
in the womb, right?
Or even in the womb, right? Because these embryos have never seen the inside of a womb. And so that's why there's like another camp of people that think that it's totally okay to use human embryonic stem cells in research and therapies. And there's been kind of like a great divide. I think like some most recent polls like in the US, like some people are still kind of unsure or not like if we should be using embryonic stem cells, since like the embryo is destroyed and like you can't have, it can't become a person, right? Because you're taking out the stem cells. But others like really value the potential of really helpful research that could come out of it. So it's an interesting question. And for a while,
that is interesting.
Yeah. And for a while, like the government was like also pretty divided on this too. It's really interesting because like oftentimes when people think about science, they think it's like pretty black and white and, you know, it's untouched by like politics or like societal things. But actually, like, those things do play a role in how well science can progress and how well it can get funded. Because for a while, the government actually decided to freeze the production of any new human embryonic stem cell lines because everyone's opinion was so divided on it. And they prohibited like federal funding towards stem cell research because of this, towards human embryonic stem cell research, I should say more specifically. And I think in recent years that has been overturned. So now people can research using the embryonic stem cell lines, but it's still kind of like a topic that lingers in our minds today.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough area.
I have a question, Maia, and I'm not sure if you could answer this, but are human embryonic stem cells that are used in research, do you know if they're particularly more expensive than other cell lines, or if they're like
that's
hard
a good
to
question.
acquire?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure. I don't know the cost of purchasing one of these stem cell lines off the top of my head. I would imagine so, but also it kind of is a weird thing to think about because if you're attaching like a price to human embryonic stem cells, like some might feel strange about that and some might be like, oh, you treat it just like as any other cell. But it kind of reminds me that this interesting concept that like the embryos are donated by the parents that have formed them. So they actually sign off on a form that like says like, oh, like we know what these embryos are going to be used for. We know that they're going to be destroyed to generate the stem cell lines, but they also get no money out of it because they're donated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And whatever therapies that are developed off of the stem cell lines, like they don't get any money out of that as well. And so it's interesting. I've read some articles that are like, oh, like, should we pay people to like donate their embryos, or does that like devalue potential human life, or does it fall under the same argument as like you don't pay people to donate their organs because that could lead to like black market organ trading. God forbid there's some black market embryo trading.
Yeah.
But an interesting concept to think about.
Yeah, I was gonna say like and I don't know if you know the answer to this, Maia, but I know a lot of the times in science when it's difficult to obtain human cells, or we've kind of crossed a bridge where it may be controversial or maybe running into a bunch of ethical situations, a lot of times different cell lines are used from animals who are similar enough to us but not obviously humans, so like pigs or mice. And do you know if the vast majority of stem cell research has been in mice and pigs? Like, have human embryonic stem cells been used much more recently? Do you know when all that sort of started?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure about like a percentage of like what's used more than the others. So I know that mouse embryonic stem cells were worked on first, and probably because like people don't feel it's as much of an ethical issue compared to human embryonic stem cells. So it's actually pretty interesting because the person that first isolated and worked with human embryonic stem cells did it kind of like secretly, like he had private funding, and just kind of like submitted his paper, and there it was, like the first human embryonic stem cells to be cultured. Yeah. So it also, it's an interesting question too, because it also brings into light like animal rights. Like,
exactly.
Should we be using embryonic stem cells from animals? Like, do we value people over animals? Like, should we even like have a say in who's like more important? And also like it's kind of like a trade-off, because in order to get more information that's useful for medicine and therapies, the closest thing that you're going to have are human embryonic stem cells. And it's an animal model is good, but it won't be as close.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, it definitely raises a bunch of interesting questions. My mind's going crazy right now.
I would love to hear, Maia, a little bit about, sorry to like derail the conversation a little bit, but I really would love to hear about kind of what you have recently learned about the field of medicine and like biotechnology or biomedical research and stem cell biology? Like, what's the hot topic right now?
Yeah, and probably I think there's several hot topics just because, well, I guess I'm personally biased because I think stem cells are so interesting. So I have two examples I could give you off the top of my head. Like, one is like an interesting therapy. We've already mentioned it before, the therapy for sickle cell anemia, which is huge. It's amazing that we're able to see such promising results. Or we could go in a more wild direction that's happened recently, where people have gene edited embryonic stem cells. So I'll let you guys pick.
I would love to hear about the first option, that is about sickle cell anemia.
Yeah, so I am so excited to speak about this because this, I think, is such an important treatment, and I think it has a lot of potential to do a lot of good and improve the quality of life for several sickle cell anemia patients because it is a really painful and debilitating disease. So basically, kind of what I learned about it is that sickle cell anemia, in case anyone wants a briefer on it, it's when your red blood cells have a mutation in a specific protein that lives in them. So if anyone's curious, it's a hemoglobin gene. Those red blood cells have a mutation in that hemoglobin that makes them adopt a sickle shape. So I actually didn't know what a sickle like really was or looked like, but it kind of looks like a kind of like half moon shape. Is that a good way to describe it? Like, it's kind of like if you imagine a disc that has kind of like been punched in a little.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. And feel free to back me up on any of this background. I'm not a sickle cell expert. But basically, normal red blood cells have a different shape. So they just kind of look like a disc and not a sickle. And so because of this like shape that the sickle cells have, they can kind of like clog up in the bloodstreams and cause a lot of pain to people who have these disease. And it's just kind of not a good time at all. And so that's why I'm so excited about this therapy. So since we're talking about stem cells, the specific stem cells that give rise to red blood cells and other types of blood cells are called hematopoietic stem cells. Really long name. I think it comes from some like Latin word like heme or something is like blood. But the hematopoietic stem cells, again, are the ones that are responsible for differentiating into the red blood cells. So something cool that researchers have done is that they've taken hematopoietic stem cells out of the patient. So your hematopoietic stem cells live in your bone marrow, if anyone's curious. So they take out the bone marrow from you and isolate these hematopoietic stem cells. And then after that, they use some genetic editing techniques, so specifically CRISPR-Cas9, in order to fix the mutation that's in these hematopoietic stem cells. So the hematopoietic stem cells are going to have the sickle cell mutation, and as they differentiate into the red blood cells, that mutation is going to cause the red blood cells to become sickled shape. And so now that the researchers have used genetic editing to fix this mutation, what they're going to do is transplant them back into the patient.
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure they put them back in as stem cells, and then once they're in the body, they differentiate into red blood cells.
Okay, great. So I know there's some therapies where they do differentiate them and then put them back, but then there's also some where they have like the stem cell version and then they let that differentiate later. So it kind of depends on the case that you're looking at.
I'm pretty sure, I could be so wrong, but for some cancer stem cells therapies, they want to differentiate. Like you want like the differentiated cells. So maybe in that case, they differentiate them before putting them back in.
Yeah, that sounds right, honestly. And I know it's like for a lot of like skin transplants too. It makes sense to differentiate them into skin. Like if you have stem cells before. Yeah. But that sounds right for cancer therapies. Because like I think for like if you just have like plain old stem cells, they do release a lot of growth factors and signals on their own. So that could help like parse down the cancer phenotype.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we were talking about the hematopoietic stem cell treatment for curing sickle cell anemia. So like I mentioned before, they've isolated hematopoietic stem cells from the bone marrow. So that's where they live in the patient and in all of us. So they've taken out...
just a clarifying question. They take healthy stem cells from a donor. Is that right? So
you can
not
do
from
it...
the patient, or they take
You can do
from
it
the
both
patient?
ways, actually.
Oh,
So you can
okay.
have it... Yeah, so arguably, like, you can have them come from a healthy donor. And sometimes that works great. It's just that there's a larger risk of immune rejection since it's coming from two different people. So the way that I'm describing it right now is for an autologous transplant. So it's coming from the same person and there's little to no risk of immune rejection. But you're right. It definitely can happen either way, and it depends per patient what the best move for them is. But basically, if you're taking stem cells from the patient, you isolate them from their bone marrow, and then you perform gene editing to correct the mutation that causes sickle cell anemia in those hematopoietic stem cells. So the hematopoietic stem cells in the patient are going to have that mutation, and they're going to differentiate into the sickled cells, which is why the patient has sickle cell anemia. So by using gene editing, you're kind of like nipping the problem at the bud at a very early stage. So those hematopoietic stem cells will no longer have the mutation, and when they differentiate back into the red blood cells, those will all be healthy and not have the mutation anymore. So once scientists have the corrected, no more mutation in the hematopoietic stem cells, they transplant them back into the patient. And this is kind of interesting. The hematopoietic stem cells are just going to do their own thing in the bone marrow. They have a happy home there, a happy stem cell niche, as some like to call it. And they're going to take the cue and start differentiating into the different blood cells of the system, including the red blood cells. And those new red blood cells are going to be the healthy ones. So for a while, there's going to be like maybe some mix of sickled cells and normal red blood cells in the patient. But something that's pretty interesting about sickle cell anemia is that if you have a certain percentage of healthy red blood cells in the patient, that seems to be enough to alleviate a lot of the symptoms that they experience. So it's been a promising therapy, and I think I've read a few articles where participants in this therapy and also other types of therapy where they, like Lauren was mentioning, take stem cells from a donor and transplant them into a patient. It's been really beneficial for them, and they have a lot less pain now.
That's amazing. I have a question about that treatment. Is it do they have to repeat the treatment, or is it like a one-time treatment, and then the kind of healthy stem cells will keep producing healthy red blood cells?
Yeah, I was wondering that too.
Great questions. So I think in principle, you shouldn't have to repeat the treatment because you're basically rebuilding this entire network and system of hematopoietic stem cells in the patient. So maybe it might be necessary down the line to supplement that if like patient ever encounters something like a really severe additional illness or something like that. But in principle, if you do the transplant and you have this like new network of healthy hematopoietic stem cells that are giving rise to the healthy red blood cells, I think it should be fine. But that is to say, these are pretty new treatments too. And I think researchers are thinking of the same exact questions you guys are thinking about, because since these treatments are pretty new, they're still going to follow the patients like for years and years and years to see if they require additional transplants. So I guess we'll have to see whether or not it's a one-time thing or you need more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so amazing. Do you know how many patients have undergone this, or kind of where they're at in this the development of this treatment?
Yeah, so I believe there are a handful, I think, that I know of that have undergone the treatment and have gone on to say like, oh, like I feel better now, I feel great. So that's what I know. I'm not sure there's any like kind of like larger study being done. My inclination is yes. Since this is one of the few treatments that I think is FDA approved or has gone through a lot of the hurdles, or not hurdles, but kind of like different phases of clinical trials and testing to be able to be used in patients. So I would say there has been some testing done, but I think we still need a lot of time to figure out like the long-term effects of these, of the treatment on the patients. But yeah, I would say I would be kind of surprised if it was like a huge number. But maybe my inclination is that there's like some small cohort out there. I could be wrong though.
It's really promising.
Definitely
though.
something really interesting.
Yeah, it's really promising. Because like it almost relates to, and I'm sure there's a whole field of research and avenue for this, but like, you know, as we were talking about before, the intersection of cancer and stem cells and kind of unlocking the immune system to treat, I guess, both of them in a way. I mean, I kind of think I don't know, in my head, I kind of conceptualize stem cells in a way as like part of the immune system. Or they have like a pretty, I would say, semi-direct connection, depending on the stem cell. But yeah, I think all this therapy is really cool because in a certain sense, you are just nipping it right in the bud, these diseases and lifelong illnesses.
Yeah, it was pretty wild to me because I was like, wow, they're really just building like a whole new like system of making blood cells like in your body. And that is crazy. And how do they know how to do that? Stem cells just know to take signals from the things around them. And they're like, okay, I'm going to do all these things now. Don't worry about it. So that's really fascinating. Not to say that like every stem cell treatment is like perfect, you know? So there's actually like some kind of like wild things that people are doing that have kind of like given the public like a bad rep about stem cells. So maybe you guys have heard about this, but there's like a bunch of like phony stem cell companies out there that are claiming to like cure everything with like a transfusion of stem cells. And it's like a little wild because none of their treatments that they do are like FDA approved.
Yeah, how does that even happen? I wonder like how that's possible, really. Like, how do they have the facilities and like the system to do that?
It's very interesting because I essentially like I'm under the impression that it's just like independent labs like doing what they want, and if they can convince a patient to give consent to the procedure that they do, then it's fine legally, I guess. But I would say no, because I think they're violating a lot of bioethical principles. Because for one, like I think with any treatment, you know, there needs to be careful like consideration into making sure that it's safe. So lots of clinical trials, lots of informing patients, this is what we're going to do and what we expect. Here are the pros and cons and the risks and benefits and all that. But it seems like these kind of shady stem cell clinics are just fast tracking it and like using the promise of like a potential and like a potentially cool and like novel technology to just kind of like very quickly do treatments that haven't been approved yet. So also another danger of science, like it makes me think about like that Jurassic Park quote where it's like, oh, we were so caught up in like thinking of if we could do it, and instead of asking why or if we should even do it at all.
Yeah. Like, we can do it. Does that mean we should do it? Kind of thing. Yeah. Right? No, I think that's really interesting. And I think it brings up a really interesting point when thinking about kind of science and the public and how science is perceived, because it is challenging when you are kind of like consuming a lot of information, and you're seeing, for example, these like, as I'm going to use Maya's quote, phony stem cell treatments. Of course you see that and you think either, wow, this is amazing promise, and it's based on science, but really it's a far stretch from like some basic science principles, right? They've really stretched the principles that have been proved in the hypotheses that have been proved. So you either like see that and you think, wow, that's amazing, and then you find out later in the line that after all the money you spent, or you know, the treatment you underwent, that it actually was not scientifically backed. Of course that's going to make you hesitant of like any other scientifically associated or scientifically backed concept or new technology. And so I think it's really sad, because there is so much potential for like amazing new medicine and like biotechnology products, but we really need to make sure that like we balance this fine line between, you know, regulations and kind of everyone doing their due diligence versus I mean, I guess you can't control what people are doing independently, but I just think it's important for like listeners who are in the scientific field or not, just to be aware that you know, there are people out there that may not have your best interests at heart, and and that's why we have things like, you know, organizations like the FDA and kind of all these authorization bodies.
Yeah, and I 100% agree with you, Lauren. And I think like a good way to kind of combat this is just like talk about stem cells more and talk about treatments and talk about like all the things that you need to have for a safe treatment and like all the pros and cons, and just like get all this information out to everyone. Because I think like if everyone kind of has like knowledge and is educated about kind of like these biological principles and what we can expect from them in the field as of now, it'll give like, I think, a more informed perspective on what stem cells are doing today. And so, because like I was thinking somebody could hear about like a shady stem cell treatment. Like one of the examples is like, oh, people are using like umbilical cord blood, which has stem cells, to like cure arthritis or something like that. So they might hear that and then know that it's phony, but then they would say, oh, well, like, how does that make that different from like the sickle cell treatment? Like, isn't that like also phony because like you're also like using stem cells? So it's good to know, I think, both sides of the coin.
Absolutely. I was going to say, like, it's really important to have conversations like this, and it's important for everybody to have conversations like this, whether you're in science or your profession is in a different field, because it's not like us scientists have the answers either. I mean, I know we kind of touch on this theme all the time, but it's true, we don't. And this is a field that's rapidly evolving, and we're still all trying to figure it out, and we're all trying to figure it out together. So I'm really glad we're doing this.
Yeah, I have a question for the two of you. If you are a someone who doesn't have a scientific background, and you came across these treatment options, let's say you have arthritis and you see kind of this company or this person, this individual approaches you with this stem cell treatment, where do you turn to, or how do you find out if it's legitimate? Kind of how can you do that?
Yeah, that is a good question, because I think it's honestly not an easy thing to do. So we actually like took a look at one of these like phony stem cell company websites, and like the website looks legit. Like they have things like on that website that say, oh, like we've like tested it, and it's like they have like a very specific wording that says like, oh, it's past like FDA standards of manufacturing, but it's not quite, it's been through FDA approved like clinical trials. So those kind of like tiny things, I think, are good to look out for. But again, it's like pretty hard to know like for sure, since these companies are using like such careful wording. So what I would recommend is that for one, trying to see, like, I think like news articles are always like a great way to see kind of like what's going on behind these treatments, because a lot of the way that these stem cell companies were exposed was because they had a lot of incidences of like hospitalizations and serious injuries after their treatments. So if you see a company out there like that has a pretty high record of sending their patients to the hospitals, I would probably not recommend those treatments since they seem pretty risky and could cause harm to you.
Yeah.
And a lot of, a big basis of those treatments and those incidences of like sending patients to hospitals was that they were experiencing septic shock. So the companies weren't being really sterile when performing the transplants and whatever.
Yeah.
So I would recommend looking into like the history, the testimonials, some things you see on the news about these companies, and also like asking a friend. So maybe you have a friend who's a biologist or stem cell enthusiast, and you can ask them what they think. And do you think like this treatment is real or legit? Would you recommend it to me? And that sort of thing.
I would also probably, as a person, or I mean, as someone who doesn't know too much about stem cells or potential treatments offered to me, whether I'm in science or not, I would probably consult two things. One, my physician, who could probably point me in the right direction and kind of give me, okay, these are the red herrings. This is what you should be wary of. But then also, a lot of times, and maybe Maia, you even know about this in general, is like a national database or something, some center that has like a national website that's kind of backed by the government that lists the organizations that you could go through, or the ones that are safe and have the results up there and readily available to the public. That's probably something else that I would look for.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's exactly what I was going to say. If you have, if you turn to your primary care provider, and also kind of search on, like national health websites or centers, I think that could be really helpful. So to turn to more of like the kind of general overview and like snapshot of stem cells, is there anything else, Maia, that you would like to cover in this episode? I know that there's so much to do with stem cells that we could talk about, but is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you're super excited about?
Yeah, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. So for one, I guess to wrap up, we talked about what stem cells are, their different jobs in our bodies. So stem cells can have varying levels of potencies or ability to turn into something else. And there are some stem cells that have a super great ability to turn into all sorts of cells in our body and are useful for research and therapeutics. And we also ran into some of the interesting ethical controversies that come with using stem cells. So, for example, we talked about embryonic stem cells and the issues there, how that might be an issue for people who have differing opinions on when life truly begins. And also for stem cell treatments and how to know if those are legit or not, and whether or not you should, well, not whether or not, but how to balance making exciting and very useful therapeutic discoveries while also very rigorously making sure treatments are safe and good for the people that they are targeted towards. So yeah, I think that about covers all sorts of interesting thing about stem cells. And, we could talk about this all day, but I think that is a great snapshot of all of the things that go into thinking about stem cell biology and the ethics around them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Maia. That was super interesting. I learned a lot, and I really hope our listeners learned something new today.
Yeah, this was fantastic.
Well, thank you everybody for tuning in to today's episode on stem cells and biology. So if you have a question or a comment, please feel free to let us know. and you know where to find us on all our social media channels. We look forward to hearing from you. If you are considering a regenerative medicine product and have questions about how it is regulated, including whether FDA approval is required, whether it is FDA approved, or what to consider before participating in a clinical trial, we urge you to call 800-835-4709 or email ocod@fda.ahs.gov for more information.